Hi, class. Today we are going to talk about intestinal contractions and motility. I want you to know that there are two main types of movement in the intestine. The first one is peristalsis. Know that peristalsis is a weaker contractile force in the small intestine. It is very strong in the esophagus and the stomach. The second contractile force is called segmentation, and this is the dominant contractile force in the small intestine. Segmentation helps to break down the chyme further and get mixed with digestive juices. Now, the question is, what causes the intestine to contract? Well, intestine has smooth muscle cells. And mixed with these smooth muscle cells are some specialized cells called interstitial cells of Cajal. Some people also call it interstitial cells of Cajal or simply Cajal cells. Now remember, these Cajal cells are not neurons. They are neither muscle cells. These are just some specialized cells that work like pacemakers and produce something called slow waves. Now, before we understand slow waves, let's talk a little bit more about muscle cells and Cajal cells and how they are connected to each other. Okay, so here let's focus on the diagram first. We do see some blue cells. These cells have cytoplasmic extensions and they are connected to each other, right? These cells are called interstitial cells of Cajal. Now, these cells, they act like pacemaker cells, and I mentioned that they produce slow waves. Now, okay, first thing we have to understand here, the interstitial cells of Cajal, they are connected to each other by gap junctions. Also, the Cajal cells are connected to the underlying smooth muscle cells, which are shown by the red cells in this diagram. So these Cajal cells or Cajal cells are connected to the smooth muscle cells by gap junctions as well. So we have gap junctions between the Cajal cells and gap junctions between Cajal cells and muscle cells. And of course, individual smooth muscle cell is connected to its neighboring smooth muscle cell by gap junctions. And what do we know about gap junctions? Gap junctions are specialized connections between cells that help ions to pass easily from one cell to the next. Therefore, wherever we find gap junctions, we think of faster communication between cells, right? Okay, so here the blue cells or the Cajal cells, they produce slow waves. And the slow waves are waves of depolarization. And if a slow wave is strong enough, it will be conducted towards the smooth muscles, as we see by the black arrow here, and that will open up voltage gated calcium ion channels on the muscle cells. So now as these calcium channels open up, calcium carrying positive charges will enter the muscle cells and cause the muscle cells to depolarize. And when these smooth muscle cells are depolarized enough, they produce action potential. the action potential will ultimately lead to contraction of smooth muscles. Now, I want you to understand that these stimulations travel only short distances. Therefore, Cajal cells need to initiate the same process for a nearby muscle contraction to take place. All these muscle contractions together produces multiple waves that ultimately causes segmentation. So to review, the blue cells are called Cajal cells. They are connected to each other by gap junctions. At the bottom, we see the red cells, which are smooth muscle cells. The smooth muscle cells are also connected to other smooth muscle cells by gap junctions. And the Cajal cells are connected to the smooth muscle cells by gap junctions. So in short, every cell is connected to other cell by gap junctions. And gap junctions help in faster communication between cells by faster flow of ions. Good? Okay, now these Cajal cells, they produce something called slow waves, which are nothing but wave of depolarization. It's a depolarizing signal. I also want you to know that these Cajal cells or Cajal cells, they are called pacemaker cells. Now, if the slow wave is strong enough, it comes down, as shown by the black arrow, to the smooth muscle cells and opens up voltage-gated calcium channels on the smooth muscle cells. As voltage-gated calcium channels open up, obviously positively charged calcium enters the muscle cells and causes the muscle cells to be depolarized enough to shoot out an action potential. This action potential ultimately leads to muscle contraction. Okay, and also remember, these stimulations do not travel far. Therefore, neighboring Cajal cells also need to produce similar slow waves, which will eventually trigger contraction in neighboring smooth muscles. And when we combine all these actions together, we get segmentation, which is a dominant contractile force of the small intestine. If you are having trouble understanding this concept, I highly recommend you shoot out an email to me so we can talk about this further. All right. Moving on to the large intestine. You have learned about the anatomy of the large intestine in your Bio 239 class, but this lecture warrants a quick review of the anatomy. So if you look at the picture of the large intestine here, we see that the large intestine forms a three-sided perimeter around the small intestine. And the distal part of the small intestine, which is called the ileum, leads to the large intestine by a teeny tiny valve called ileocecal valve, as you can see labeled in this diagram. So the first part of the small intestine, which is this pouch-like structure, is called cecum, that leads to the ascending colon. That leads to the transverse colon, which moves transversely, leading to the descending colon. The descending colon leads to an S-shaped sigmoid colon, terminating in rectum, and the rectum leads to the anal canal and the external anal opening. Okay? So that's in short the basic anatomy of the large intestine. Now the question is, what happens in the large intestine? I want my students to know that most of the food is digested in the small intestine, and nutrient absorption also take place in the small intestine. So small intestine is basically the place where most digestion and absorption take place. So the question is then, what is going on in the large intestine? Large intestine is mainly responsible for reabsorption of water and electrolytes. And as water and electrolytes are reabsorbed, all the undigested food matter gets compacted together to form something called feces. The fecal matter is stored in the large intestine for some time until the right time comes and we defecate to get rid of the fecal matter. The large intestine also stores feces for considerable amount of time. Now, again, remember, in the large intestine, we have water reabsorption and electrolyte reabsorption and compaction of undigested food to form feces. The large intestine also stores feces. So in exam, if I ask you in which part of the digestive system do we have maximum digestion and nutrient absorption, remember, your answer should be small intestine in that case. All right. Now, some medical conditions associated with the large intestine. The first one is appendicitis. It is a condition where the vermiform appendix, which is actually a vestigial organ, gets inflamed. So there is inflammation of the appendix. Now, the appendix, it contains lymphoid nodules and a population of commensal bacteria, which helps to replenish a normal intestinal microbiota. However, fecal matter can enter appendix and cause inflammation. I want you to understand that appendicitis, if left untreated, can lead to death. So the appendix can burst and all the fecal matter will get into the peritoneum. That can lead to severe infection and in extreme cases can lead to death of the patient. Appendix has no role in digestion. Remember that appendix has no role in digestion. Another condition, medical condition associated with the large intestine is diarrhea, which is mainly caused by stomach flu. And during diarrhea, a patient loses excessive fluid in the fecal matter. And again, if left untreated, this can lead to severe dehydration and even death. All right. I will stop here. So to review, actually, let's do a quick review in a minute. And then in another video, I will go over the accessory digestive structures or organs. Okay, so we talked about intestinal contractions. There are two major forces, remember. Peristalsis is the weaker one in the intestine. However, peristalsis is super strong in the esophagus and stomach. Segmentation is the dominant force in the intestine. And segmentation is caused by some specialized cells called interstitial cells of Cajal, which are neither neurons nor smooth muscle cells. We did look at the mechanism by which these Cajal cells produce slow waves, which actually lead to depolarization of smooth muscles, and in turn, the smooth muscles shoot out action potential. I want you to remember again that the Cajal cells do not produce action potential. They produce slow waves, which in turn causes these smooth muscle cells to spike action potential. Potential question for your lecture exam too. All right.